So, welcome everyone on behalf of Center for India West Asia Dialogue. And I'm very thankful for the privilege of your time and your presence today. Today, we have a very distinguished guest, Mark Seddon, who is the director of the Center for United Nations Studies at the University of Buckingham, UK, which was officially opened in September 2019. Something which I really know him for is in 2019 starting Palestinian Deep Drive, because it was one particular platform that allowed me to hear very important and essential voices, be it Chomsky or Miko Peled and others, which was very rare while I was sitting in India during the time of the pandemic. And it continued in me to learn so much from this initiative by Mark Seddon. Mark Seddon was also the media advisor to Maria Fernanda Espinosa, who is an Ecuadorian diplomat and politician, and was the president of United Nations General Assembly. He has worked as the editor of Tribune, United Nations, and diplomatic correspondent for Al Jazeera English. He has been the speechwriter to the Secretary General of UN, Ban Ki-moon, and Director of Communications for International Commission on Financing Global Education Opportunity, which was chaired by UN Special Envoy for Global Education and former UK Prime Minister, Honorable Gordon Brown. He has also been an activist and parliamentary candidate with the Labour Party of UK and served on the National Executive Committee, the National Policy Forum, and Economic Policy Commission chaired by Gordon Brown. One thing which is spectacular, along with the fact that Mark Seddon has been a journalist, he has also been an activist when, with the UK's involvement when it came to Iraq and Afghanistan, being very critical about it, and reporting from North Korea, China, and other places, and voicing his opinion when most of the major news networks were not highlighting issues of human rights that were happening all over the world. So we are very privileged to have a person of his stature to come and speak with us today. And it is a very rare opportunity. And I'm really very thankful, sir. Over to you now.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Chowdhury. Thank you so much. And I remember when you first came on to Palestine Deep Dive, you were in the audience and we got in touch then. And thank you. And I'm so glad that you've asked me today. I'm actually here in England. It's guess what? It's grey. It's threatening with a bit of rain. But what can you do? Anyway, look, thank you so much. It was a very nice, very kind introduction from you too. Look, I can't claim to be an expert in this field. Most of my knowledge, I suppose, has been based, on experience, really. I've been, as Dr. Chowdhury was saying, I've been a reporter, a foreign correspondent, and I've worked for the United Nations. So I've had occasion to report from the Middle East. And so I've reported from a number of countries, actually, if I think about it, which I hadn't before coming on today. I've reported from Libya, from Morocco, from Tunisia, from Egypt, from Syria, from Jordan, from Yemen, and also from the occupied Palestinian territories. I have been to the West Bank, and like you have, Dr. Chowdhury, and to Israel. I remember some years ago traveling to the West Bank with a delegation. We'd actually been in Iraq. This was prior to the Iraq War, which I didn't mention. And that we went to the West Bank. We actually went to the town of Jenin in the occupied Palestinian territories. This may be familiar to some of you because it's a lot in the news at the moment. There have been a whole series of Israeli military raids on Jenin. We went there shortly after there had been a firefight between Palestinian militants, as they're called, or combatants, as they're called, or fighters, as they're called, and the IDF. I just remember standing, because this is my memory of Jenin. This is an action by the Israeli military to kill Palestinians who are fighting against Israeli occupation. And I remember looking at the ruins of this town, looking at the bulldozers that had gone through it, and looking now at what I'm seeing in Gaza. There is a horrible asymmetry to events. And, I suppose I think it's important to try and get an understanding of where we are, because as the Secretary General Antonio Guterres said in firstly an article in the New York Times, which nobody seemed to be bothered about, but then subsequently when he said it at the General Assembly and there was a protest from the Israeli permanent representative, he said of October 7th, this didn't come out of the blue, or this didn't come from nowhere. And what he meant by that, of course, was that that attack by Hamas on Israeli civilians and military on October the 7th was not an isolated incident, the first incident, because as we know, this whole conflict, this whole war has been continuing for over a century. And I think we have to look back. We don't have to go into ancient history, but this part of and I wish we're currently in the process of moving house. Otherwise, I'd be able to show you a map from an atlas I have, which was published circa 1914, and which shows the borders of then Palestine. Now, Palestine and Transjordan, they were all part of the Ottoman Empire for around 500 odd years. Essentially, it's often thought that Palestine was virtually an empty land, but no, the population of historic Palestine, which conforms basically to the border of Israel plus the occupied territories now, was populated by overwhelmingly Arab Muslims, Palestinian Arab Muslims, by Palestinian Christians, and by Palestinian Jews. They were all Palestinians in the Ottoman Empire. Now, what we did, of course, see is the beginning, certainly towards the end of the 1800s, the problem that has been raging, especially in Europe, for centuries of anti-Semitism, the pogroms against Jewish people, the discrimination and anti-Semitism that frequently saw Jewish people being driven from their homes, from their towns, from their villages. It reached a kind of crescendo in Tsarist Russia with an awful lot of Jewish people having to flee for their lives. Many, of course, went to the New World, to America. Many came to Britain and to Europe. Some went to Palestine. Historically, there'd always been, as we just mentioned, a Jewish population in Palestine, and they were called Palestinians. I know Palestinians, who are Jewish Palestinians who were born before 1948, who still refer to themselves as Palestinian, by the way. So things are never easy to understand when it comes to a very, very complex part of the world with a complex and bitter history. And this is the issue, I think, that we really do face, because I think it's really important. If anybody is seriously interested in conflict resolution and ending warfare and ending prejudice, then you have to try and understand where people are coming from, and you have to try and understand their history. So we go back to what the Secretary General said. This didn't come from nowhere, because what has been fairly apparent, I think, from so much of the media coverage and the political reaction, and especially, I would say, in the West, is that there is a profound ignorance. And also a double standards, a hypocrisy when it comes to what has been described as settler colonialism. And by what I mean by that is that essentially, going back to the turn of the last century and the fall of subsequently the First World War, the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, partly by the British, the decision by two people, Sykes and Picot. Sykes was the British and Picot was the French, to partition let me turn this off, to partition what was then Transjordan and the Middle East, the Near East, into zones of influence, into zones of mandates. So we saw, for instance, the French being given, as a result of this agreement at the end of the First World War, a mandate to govern Lebanon and Syria. And we saw Britain being given a mandate to govern Transjordan and Palestine. So the British mandate at the end of the Second World War also saw a growing number of people coming from Europe to settle in Palestine. And they did so because in 1917, of course, there was that most historic of interventions by Imperial Britain, which was the Balfour Declaration. Now, I don't know if many of you have heard of the Balfour Declaration, but essentially Balfour, as a minister in the British government, believed that there had to be a solution and there had to be a homeland for Jewish people. And his letter to some of the Zionist leaders of the time said that essentially Palestine would be a home for the Jewish people, but also mindful of Britain's commitments under the mandate that this should not in any way infringe upon the rights of those who were already there. Now, I have to say that Balfour, looking back through the years, and many of the people who were lobbying hard in the British establishment for this to happen were very often anti-Semitic and actually saw this idea of settling Jewish people in Palestine as a way of ensuring that not too many more Jewish people came to live in Britain. So the old anti-Semitism that people were fleeing from in Russia and Eastern Europe meant that there were people in Britain who were not engaged in pogroms as such. Of course, no, they weren't doing that. But what they were saying was, yes, perhaps you should go and you should live in Palestine. Now, at that time, at the end of the Second World War, at the beginning of the British Mandate, I believe there were about 750,000 people living in Palestine. And the vast majority were Arab Muslims, Palestinian Muslims, Palestinian Christians. The Palestinian Jewish population was a minority, but it was a growing one. Now, that is simply a reality. Now, we've seen throughout, as you know, if you studied these things, other parts of the world where people have come in from other countries and settled, and they've either reached some kind of accommodation with the people who are already there. You could argue that in New Zealand that might have happened to a degree, but in other parts of the world, settlers have often tried to dominate after a time when they get to a point of a majority of the population. And you can very clearly see that has happened in Australia and, of course, in North America, with the Native Americans being forced into reservations. Something very similar, of course, happened in Algeria with the French. By the time of Algeria's independence in 1962, there were some 1 million Pieds Noirs, they were called, French Algerians, and Algeria was part of metropolitan France. Now, they were refusing to reach any kind of accommodation with the Algerians, and ultimately they lost. The French government withdrew, and the French Pieds Noirs settlers returned to Algeria. In South Africa, of course, a rather different story, as you're probably familiar. And you can draw parallels too in the way that the kind of administration of justice and the administration of borders is undertaken in South Africa and Israel, because there has been a very strong argument made, not least by former President Jimmy Carter, by former President Mandela, from former Archbishop Tutu, that essentially the system being operated in the occupied Palestinian territories is a system of apartheid akin to that of South Africa. But the reason I mentioned South Africa is that there was ultimately an agreement, an accommodation, a truth and reconciliation, a power sharing, and then a one person, one vote. And that meant that the Afrikaners, the Dutch-speaking minority, gave up the sole power that they had in South Africa. There is majority rule, and there has been a settlement, and the Afrikaners, for the most part, anybody who wishes to be part of the new South Africa, it doesn't matter what race, religion, gender, creed, whatever you are. So in some respects, many people have been holding South Africa up as a possible model. But in a way, I digress, because I think what happened as during the 1920s, the 1930s, there was the beginning of a reaction against British rule in mandated Palestine, partly from the Palestinian Arabs, also from Palestinian Jews. And this grew because the numbers of Jewish people fleeing from persecution in Europe was also growing, especially in the 1930s with the rise of Nazi Germany. And so a lot of people who could were trying to flee, and who can blame them? And so there was a growing Jewish population in Palestine, and a pushback by Palestinian Muslims, Arabs against this, saying, well, the mandate, the British are not following their mandate properly, and we are being pushed out of our lands. Now, this process, of course, continued. There was the interruption of the Second World War. Now, interestingly, during that period, many of the hostilities that had been continuing throughout the 20s and the 30s did desist between Palestinian Arabs and the British, and Palestinian Jews and the British. However, there were some small Zionist groups that were opposed to British rule and continued to fight the British throughout the Second World War. And of course, there were some links between some religious Muslim groups and those in Nazi Germany. I mean, that is the honest truth of the situation. So Britain had a situation in Palestine during the Second World War when there was still what is described as terrorist activity going on, principally actually from two very hardline groups, the Stern Gang and the Haganah. It culminated with a number of British soldiers being killed, and after the ending of the Second World War, with the terrorist attack on the King David Hotel, which hundreds of British servicemen were killed when the Stern Gang blew it up, or perhaps it was the Haganah, I can't remember. But either which way, it's instructive given where we are, because yesterday's terrorist is often tomorrow's prime minister or president. That's simply a rule of thumb very often, that there are at least two prominent Israeli political figures who rose to become prime minister, who had been actively fighting the British, and in the case of one, had actually physically killed British people. Now, the first one was Menachem Begin, the prime minister, who also became the great man of peace when finally a peace agreement was signed by Israel with Egypt and Israel and Jordan. So that shows what can happen. But also Yitzhak Shamir, another right-wing Israeli political leader and prime minister, who is intricately involved in the assassination of the United Nations envoy to Palestine, Count Bernadotte, and also in the killing of the British policeman who arrested him some years before. So, it's a very, very complex, difficult history, and one that has seen essentially the seeds of this conflict planted long, long ago. Now, the British mandate finished in 1948 because Britain realized that it not only had it been weakened by the ending of the Second World War, but it had no real reason to want to remain in Palestine, and it wanted to get out as quickly as possible, which it did. And in the formal ceremony, when they pulled the flag down in Haifa, there were representatives of the new state that was going to be born, but only one part of that state, and that was Israel. There were no Palestinian Arabs present when Britain withdrew from its mandate in Palestine. Now, as I was saying earlier, the Balfour Letter, Balfour Declaration made it clear that Britain was supposedly even-handed, but at that time, Britain withdrew, and subsequent to that, of course, we had the UN General Assembly decision to partition historic Palestine, essentially into three parts, four parts possibly, but essentially two parts being Israel and Palestine. Israel taking 56% of the land, the Palestinian territories, which were to include East Jerusalem and the West Bank and Gaza, constituted the rest. At that time, many countries who were already members of the United Nations recognized Israel, including Britain, in 1948, but Palestine was not recognized. And only in recent years, really, has Palestine been recognized by some UN member states around the world. Britain still has not recognized the state of Palestine, although there is a promise by the opposition Labour Party that if it's elected to office, that it would do so. Look, I think, you know, to cut through, essentially what we saw post 1948, the partition of Palestine, was also a belief amongst the Arab states around that Israel was an aberration, it was unacceptable, and certainly we have to face up to the fact that many Palestinians and many of their organizations were totally opposed to the very existence of Israel. And also, whilst the Nakba, which was to follow the end of the British mandate, when settlers moved in big time and the Israeli state was created and 700,000 Palestinians were driven out of their homes and into, when you hear people talk about refugee camps today in Gaza or the West Bank, these are the same refugee camps that have been there since 1948. This gives you some idea of the sheer scale of what happened. Whilst that Nakba was happening in Palestine, with Palestinian Arabs being driven from their lands and from their homes, there was a similar kind of process going on elsewhere throughout North Africa and the Maghreb, and that was. I'll take your question at the end if I might, because I haven't got too much longer to go. I just want to continue, but by saying that what was also happening was that the Jewish populations of many Middle Eastern and North African countries were being pushed out as well, and so the historic Jewish Iraqi population was effectively moved out of Iraq. The same happened in Morocco. I've been to Libya. I've stood in a cowshed and looked up at the ceiling and realized that it's a former synagogue. So this whole process was happening in a counter way right throughout the Middle East, as well as the Nakba going on in Palestine. And the subsequent wars, the 1967 war, the Six-Day War, when the Arab armies were defeated by Israel in a very pronounced way, and when the occupation of those territories began, the Palestinian territories that they had been given in 1948, and then subsequently the Yom Kippur War in 1973, when the Egyptians were roundly defeated by the Israelis, and of course the subsequent intifadas we've had, the risings of the Palestinian people, one intifada, two intifadas, and now successive wars in Gaza every 5, 6, 7 years. There's been a terrible pattern, particularly in Gaza. And the reason being is that essentially Gaza, although occupied by the Israelis, was never, although there were some illegal Israeli settlements in Gaza, and there had been attempts by Prime Minister Ben-Gurion to occupy Gaza, there had never been, because it was so highly populated, congested, and frankly of less economic worth although things have changed now, I suspect, with the discovery of all this gas off the coast of Gaza. The Israeli occupation of Gaza was not as entrenched, I think, as it is in West Bank and East Jerusalem. And so they did, as part of previous agreements, pull out of Gaza militarily, although maintained an economic blockade since the election of Hamas in 2006. And of course, when Hamas was first elected, it was supposedly a non-violent organization. It was elected primarily because most Palestinians in Gaza thought it was less corrupt than Fatah, the PLO, and also because they had a kind of social welfare provision function as an organization. Look, we are at a stage now where this particular war has been 6 weeks. We have had the former United Nations Special Envoy on prevention of genocide, saying that this is now looking very much like genocide. We've seen various other people who are experts in this field saying the activities in Gaza look like genocide. We have seen a staggering number of fatalities and injuries. I'm trying to establish through UN figures whether that is true. The reports in Turkish media today that the average age of the person killed in Gaza over the past 6 weeks is the age of 5. I mean, let that sink in if that is true, and it's highly likely. We have seen perhaps 14,000 odd civilians killed, countless injured in Gaza. We, of course, saw the action of Hamas, which has killed perhaps 1,200 civilians and also military. So we are at a situation whereby this whole history, this whole 100 years history, is still unraveling before us. The hatreds seem to run so deep. The difficulties of achieving peace seem so far away, and yet there have been attempts. The Oslo Accords, for instance, the promise of a Palestinian homeland, and by the way, that promise is being made once again by the United States and by the European Union and others. They're talking about the two-state solution. Of course, Palestinians look at this rather wryly and they say, well, you know, this is what was promised to us in those Oslo Accords. What have we ended up with? And actually, if you look at the map, the physical map of historic Palestine and the occupied Palestinian territories, you can see the Area A parts of the occupied West Bank and Jerusalem. These are small sections now. You're looking at a completely truncated, broken up series of effectively Bantustans, which today amount to a degree of Palestinian autonomy in the West Bank. That, sadly, is where we are. Much, I think, owes to imperial history, imperial pomp and imperial promise, and the reality of essentially a terrible, terrible Holocaust in Europe, which was a European-driven Holocaust. This Holocaust did not happen in Palestine, didn't happen anywhere else. It happened primarily because of Nazi Germany and its followers, camp followers in the rest of Europe. And therefore, you cannot blame people who managed to survive that, thinking, do I really have a place in Germany or Austria or Russia or Ukraine or any of these places after what's happened to me? But of course, what has happened is that what has become a kind of settler colonial project in Palestine has led to these terrible unresolved conflicts and a war that is continuing right before us now. We're at a 4-day ceasefire. Many people are hoping that it may become a permanent ceasefire, but that may be a forlorn hope. Look, Dr. Chowdhury, thank you very much indeed. I probably talked for long enough, and
No,
I
no,
know
no.
someone asked me a question. And people feel please ask me anything. I'll do my best. I can't, as I say that I'm an expert